Okay, here we go. Hey, it's another episode. It's Film Streak. I'm Rob. We're watching new movies. That's just what we do here. And this episode, I wanted to go into another kind of specific lane. I've got some things. Look, I watch movies all the time. And I've been watching movies every week, almost every day. And part of it is to just have things to talk about here. But sometimes it's kind of random, just the order and the way that I go about watching something. And so I went and watched Longlegs. And as I was watching the film, I'll talk about it a little more in depth in a minute. But as I was watching it, it just occurred to me, it was like, the lead actor in that is Maika Monroe. And ever since The Guest, I think that's probably the first time I kind of paid attention to like, who is this? And there was a point where I really thought, oh, here's someone who's kind of new, upcoming. It's going to be a star. It kind of has a presence, has, movie star looks, has a certain charisma even. But in some films I've seen her in, she's doing different things in different ways. And Longlegs, specifically, it really made me think of some other films and some other performances in other films. But I said, you know what, maybe I need to kind of catch up a little bit because I haven't really paid attention to a lot of what Maika Monroe has done, especially in these types of films, like horror films. I've seen The Guest, and I remember seeing a film called Hot Summer Nights. And it's just one of those where I'm like, okay, well, here's another is kind of really interesting choice in this role, in this type of film. And, the one film I hadn't seen that I think a lot of people kind of talked about, there was a buzz around it for a while, was It Follows. And that is a film that I still haven't seen yet. And I wanted to see it as part of this episode, but then I saw that there is possibly a sequel in the works. So maybe I'll hold off on that. We'll get to that some other day. All right, you know what? Say, look, so I'm going to break in here. Turns out I lied. I actually watched It Follows. I watched it in the time between when I recorded this episode and when you're hearing it, when it's actually going out. I sat and I watched It Follows. I just kind of couldn't resist. I really thought I'm going to wait and do like a double feature with the sequel. But as I looked into the sequel, it's like very early stages. It's probably not going to come out for a while. So I said, all right, let me just watch It Follows and let me get a sense. Maybe this kind of changes my conversation a little bit. But I said what I said, right? Regarding It Follows, though, I'm super late to the party, of course. This is like 10 years after it's come out. But what an interesting concept. What an interesting execution of it. And the idea of basically kind of finding new territory in the horror genre is really hard. Right? The premises, the conceits that you build a story on for a horror film kind of feels like we've done it all already, Like everything's been tried. Everything's in some way or another at least given a shot on film. And here, I think this was something that is so simple and so obvious that someone somehow never took a shot at it. And, watching It Follows, the idea of this sort of presence or supernatural thing that follows you, that is basically traveling along with your, sexual history, sexual experience, and it's passed from partner to partner. I mean, there's plenty of metaphors and comparisons you could draw, and I'm sure that was the idea, is it's really kind of broad, it's kind of open to your interpretation, but I'm just fascinated with the execution of it, really, because it is so basic, and yet it's compelling, because I think it's all, a part of it is, this is an experience that any of us have gone through in some way or another. The feelings of it, not, of course, a thing following you, but something that you've done, or a place that you've been, or an experience that you've had, sticking with you and always being present somewhere in your life. As far as Maika Monroe in this, I think she's actually really strong as a lead because this is a character that has to play sort of both sides of this equation of being, I don't know if innocent is the word, but just being unassuming and then having to find that within her to try and escape, try and get away from this thing, try and figure a way out of it. And ultimately, by the end, kind of coming to terms with it in a way, right? Yeah, it's funny, like the film stylistically, I think it follows a little bit, haha, no pun, sorry. It feels like it's crafted in a similar mold to something like Halloween. Plays very quietly, even the whole opening, even the very end, the last scene of the film, just very simple and showing us this part of the country, like this sort of suburban setting where not a lot happens maybe, and these young people, they really don't have a lot to complicate their lives until this becomes a factor, right? And honestly, the idea of the, I don't know, the presence, the villain, the shape standing at a distance and just watching you and following you. I mean, that's directly out of Halloween, right? That is the first time we see Michael Myers in Haddonfield. He's just standing on the street, standing on the sidewalk. So there's some interesting kind of parallels there, because I feel like maybe that was even something that was in Halloween in a way, like the subtext of, Jamie Lee, Laurie Strode rather, is this almost virginal kind of character who doesn't involve herself, doesn't partake in the partying and the wilder life that her classmates, the other girls in the film do. But we have this character, Jay, who is similar, but also is willing to, but also, look, times are different. And Jay here goes out on a date, meets somebody, gets along, just kind of has a night of it. And that's where I think we see a difference, right? So the concept that this is something that follows you, I think that's something that we all kind of have. And that could be because, hey, you had a good time. That could be because you had a traumatic experience. So, I guess the only question I have is, why is this thing necessarily bad, right? I think that's where the film takes the license of like, well, something you maybe shouldn't have done or should have considered before doing. And now you can't take it back. And now it will kind of stick with you for the rest of your life. And I don't know if I necessarily ascribe to that, the idea that somehow sex is bad, that it is something that you almost have to hide from or be ashamed of or deny in a way. I don't know. Maybe that's me kind of reading into what the film is trying to say in a way, but if we just stick to the premise, just stick to the story, it's pretty interesting a way to approach it. And I think it is something that a younger person would relate to more than someone who's lived some life, because there is that aspect of, the whole coming of age and discovering sex, discovering your identity. That is all, I think primarily that's a young person's thing to get caught up in. All in all, good film. I'm just kicking myself that I hadn't seen it before. But all right, so look, I did get to see it. Just we'll count that on the list, and let's move on to the next one. So I looked at some films that were coming out in the last few years, and I said, well, maybe some of this looks interesting. Some of it, I don't know. I didn't want to just have films that she's in. I wanted to be films that she was kind of a lead in, or at least a co-lead in. And so I want to talk about Longlegs. I also want to talk about Villains and God is a Bullet. And then another film, The Watcher, or maybe it's just called Watcher. Let me see here. It's called Watcher. Okay, got it. The Watcher is something else. I understand. But those four films, they're all in kind of similar territory. They are thrillers. They are sort of psychologically complex and haunting and disturbing. And yet they're all very different in terms of the tone, in terms of the style. And, if we kind of go in order here, I guess chronologically, like Villains was in 2019. And in that film, she's essentially the co-star with Bill Skarsgård. They are a young couple. The very first scene, we see them robbing like a convenience store, and they make off with the money, and they're talking about their dream of this kind of Bonnie and Clyde situation, and this is what they're going to do and how they're going to make it work and live on the run. But then the car breaks down and they're stuck on the side of the road. They got to find some place to get off the road. They know police are looking for them. They find this house, but they find a girl in the basement. Then they find the owners, this couple played by Kira Sedgwick and Jeffrey Donovan. They are, at first, they appear to be kind of a typical suburban couple, husband and wife. And yet it's very clear, like there's something wrong here because they have like a 10-year-old girl tied up in the basement, right? Like chained to the wall. And there is where we have these two sets of characters, these two couples. They play out this game of this sort of battle of wits throughout the entire film because they're all stuck in this house. One couple's trying to escape. The other couple's trying to keep them from escaping. And so the whole movie kind of really fleshes that out. It's a pretty simple premise, really, when you boil it down, but at least giving us enough as an audience to kind of chew on and let these characters really work through what this is, even to the point where we just get a scene where they're trying to get out of handcuffs. And it comes down to, like, I guess more realistically, how can you do this when you have no way to reach anything? And then the one thing you might have, it's kind of tenuous. Like, could this even work? And as the scene plays out, we see like, yeah, of course it would go like that, right? And so the movie kind of operates on that level. It's at one point, it is a thriller and it is kind of dark and creepy. But on the other hand, it's kind of bright and a little playful even. I mean, Jeffrey Donovan in this film, he's doing some real work here. He's got this kind of strange, like, I don't know, genteel Southern accent. I mean, honestly, I can't help but think he's doing a little bit of like Frank Underwood, It's kind of a creepy Southern Kevin Spacey vibe that he gives in this movie. And I think that's not an accident. And even Kira Sedgwick here, who, has been around, been doing a lot of movies for decades, comes across as half pleasant and half bright and shiny, but then the other half of very kind of controlling and menacing. And when we see all of these characters really kind of flip to their other side throughout this story, it's pretty interesting work. And the way things end up, you kind of feel like, well, there's really no other way this could have played out. This is kind of the most logical, sensible result. But Maika Monroe here, specifically, her work in this film, I think it's actually pretty subdued. Like, she's not really doing the most out of all the cast, even Bill Skarsgård, who, look, dude takes big swings, right? He's Pennywise. He's even the Crow now. He's in Nosferatu coming up soon. He's doing a lot of big stuff. And in this movie, I mean, he's very simple, very plain. He's got some energy to him. He feels like a very kind of hyped up kind of version of just American young guy, but nothing so outlandish and big that you see in some of his other roles. It honestly kind of reminded me a little of his role in Barbarian, where at first, the first part of that movie, we're introduced to his character. He's the guy that's in the house by mistake somehow, and very disarming, very calm, very just chill. And that's kind of what we get here in some moments. until it's time to kind of kick in. But then we see like, well, he's not exactly a tough guy either. He's a talker, but he's not really a fighter. And it's just interesting to see all the dynamics going on, at least for the way this movie needs the cast to work. I think Maika Monroe actually brings like the voice of reason and calm to this film, to the cast. In that regard, I think the movie actually kind of works. It's entertaining. It's kind of fun. It's a little disturbing, you know, the idea of this couple and they've got this girl in the basement and it's not really clear why. I mean, they give an explanation, but it's not even clear like that's legit. And, you know, if you've ever seen a movie called Running Scared, not the one from the 80s, but the one, I don't know, maybe about 15 years ago with Paul Walker, you know, there's a scene where he stumbles on this, he stumbles into this house with this couple and turns out they're real creeps. And I can't remember who it is that is in that movie, who plays those characters, but it's super creepy, super disturbing because, you know, like there's some real like pedo type stuff going on. It's one of those things that really kind of makes you back up and step back from the movie for a second. And then when you see what happens, you're like, okay, good. You got what you deserve, right? This movie starts to function on that level a little bit until the girl in the basement isn't really a factor at some point. It's more about this couple versus that couple and how are they going to get out of this. And I think that's where she works out in this. The next film that I saw here is Watcher. And this is another film that I feel like it's in this thriller territory. You know, she plays a young American woman who moves to, I think it's somewhere in Europe. I think it's like Bucharest. Let me see. She moves there with her new husband. And he is obviously more familiar with that part of the world and the culture there and all that. He's busy with work. So she's kind of alone by herself in the new place. You know, it's just a different culture. And so some of it is this kind of fish out of water territory that we're in. And we learn some things about her, that she was a former actress. And so there's maybe a kind of a small tendency for the dramatic. We don't see it necessarily, but it starts to rear its head when she starts to see a man across the way, in the building across the way, in one of the windows. She sees this man that always seems to be looking back at her. And at first it seems kind of innocent. It's like, oh, she just happened to be looking out the window and see someone else looking out their window, until it happens over and over. And then it starts to become this situation where maybe loneliness, maybe paranoia is starting to like take over everything that she sees and feels, right? There's this tension that starts to build through all these situations. And it kind of plays on that idea that if you're looking at somebody who doesn't know you're looking at them, right? It's a little bit voyeuristic. It's even a little bit invasive, right? You're kind of watching somebody who's doing something else, and then they turn and look right at you, right? It's that weird kind of like the moment when the stranger looks back, where it's partly disorienting, it's partly alarming. And this film sort of plays on that a little bit of like, is this character, is she imagining this? Is she imagining that someone is across the way looking at her all the time? Is she imagining that they are possibly out to get her? Because there is this thread that runs throughout the film that there is a serial killer on the loose, possibly in the part of the city that they are in. And so it's kind of in the background, but you can see where this character really projects that onto this man. And the film does a pretty interesting job of pushing and pulling that idea. She thinks it's him. She thinks this guy is the killer. And so we kind of follow along and we start to see it too. But then when she approaches the man and she gets the authorities involved, and it seems like, no, he's just a guy who's maybe lonely, maybe awkward, but he's not a killer. Well, and then it kind of gives us that little bit of relief of like, oh, okay, so it's just a weird guy? That's strange in its own way, but it's not dangerous. Then as the film goes on, we start to find out more of the truth, and things get big and crazy. And so I thought it was interesting, her choice in this. This character is someone who I'm sure we could all relate to in some way or another, of just being in a strange place, being alone, even in a place you're familiar with, but then also the idea of maybe projecting or imposing your feelings onto someone else who may or may not deserve that. And so I think she's playing a few different levels here. It's kind of interesting. I think in the end, the film isn't quite the thriller that it wants to be. So it's an interesting choice. And even with just these two films, this idea of a character kind of being pulled in different directions, but also sort of trapped, sort of confined, whether it's physically or even like emotionally, I think that's an interesting parallel there. And so the next film that I saw here, it's called God is a Bullet. And this one, I actually didn't really, I had it on my list, but it wasn't necessarily just because of Maika Monroe. It was because of a few other things. This film is it written and directed by Nick Cassavetes? It's based on a book by Boston Tarrant, and the main character is Nikolai Coster-Waldau, right? But there are also some other people in here you might recognize if you just kind of look closely, And this is honestly a very strange film, and sometimes strange in a not good way. It revolves around this character. He's a police officer. His daughter is kidnapped, and he essentially picks up the case of trying to figure out what happened to her. And while that's happening, there's this other character, Maika Monroe. Her character is a young woman who is cast out of this, I don't know, it almost looks like a gang, but it really is more of like just a cult. There's a group of young people that are into some really weird shit. And she's kind of thrown out of that and having to find a way back to, let's say, the regular world. And she happens to know something about this case with the cop's daughter. So the two of them kind of team up in order to kind of figure out, like, okay, how do we get back into the gang? How do we find out what happened to his daughter? How do we bring the people who did this to justice, right? Through that, we realize, like, oh, no, this is like a whole underworld type situation. That's the premise. I think the thing that kind of hurts this film is that it wants to be so edgy and so raw and so gritty. It's super violent. It's absolutely just graphic. And it's brutal. I mean, it's not just blood and gore, but it's just the sort of depravity, of some of these characters. And as this character is introduced to this world and has to kind of infiltrate it, we start to see it from his perspective, and I guess just from our own kind of general person in the world perspective. Like, unless you're in this kind of world, this really seems strange and maybe even scary. But I think there's also a side of this that it really feels like put on. Like, one of the main things, I think it's even in the trailer maybe, but it's a point in the movie, is like everybody in this gang, in this cult, they are tatted up everywhere, just ink all up and down, right? And this character, in order to get in with these people, he's got to get his ink. And it's a thing that in the film, it's kind of strange because it feels like it was put together or written by someone who maybe has never gotten a tattoo. I don't know. Because dude sits in this chair out in the desert, and Jamie Foxx, he's got ink everywhere, and he's even got like vitiligo type issue thing going on. He tats him up, like chest, arms, even a face tattoo, everything. And I don't know what, a couple of hours. It just seems like it happens like that. And there's plenty of people who have tattoos. And I just have to kind of call bullshit on the way it's presented in this movie. It's like he just kind of sits and gets all this work done and doesn't even there's no aftercare. There's nothing involved with like making sure this doesn't, just turn into a mess. And it's never spoken of really, except for when they tell him, you're not going to be able to do this without something on you. And I don't know. I think it's kind of glossed over. I know that's probably just for cinematic purposes. Like we're not going to hang on this, but look, if you're familiar with the tattoo scene, even it's like, that's not how it goes. You're going to be down with that for at least a few weeks before you just go walk in front of people who could or could not take your life. That's just my sense of it. Anyway, besides that, I mean, the film does try to expose or reveal like the idea that there are people and they have these beliefs and they are willing to do whatever or just disregard law and order and society for their own purposes. And I'm sure that's not untrue, right? I'm sure that does exist. But in this film, I just feel like even the cast, I think they're trying, but there's so much that they have to own in terms of these characters and this way of life. I don't really feel like any of them really get there. Honestly, the only one that I think actually kind of feels sort of right is Ethan Suplee, who is in this film. He's the muscle for the bad guy, right? I only say that he seems like he kind of fits because he does look like he will take you out and he doesn't care. That's just the vibe, the presence that he has on screen. And, I think that is maybe one of the few characters in this film that actually feels like they're in the right place. Everybody else feels like they're a little bit like in cosplay mode. You know what I'm saying? It's strange. I don't know. And look, it's not only the performances, it's not even necessarily the writing, but there are some issues with just the filmmaking here. And they're minor, they're nitpicky, of course, but it's something that if you want me to be immersed, look, that's the other thing. This is a 2.5 hour movie. This is a long ass movie. And I think the idea behind that is it's trying to take you on this ride, take you on this real journey, this kind of descent into this world with these types of people. I get that. I understand that. I think that is possible. That could work. But there are there are maybe some editing issues. There are even some shots here, at least early on, I noticed, where it's like, bro, where was the focus puller? Because like your shots are like coming in and out of focus, like in the middle of dialogue. And I can't really say it's a stylistic choice. I don't feel like that was on purpose. It just feels like, man, this was maybe a real kind of run and gun type of situation that, it's like fast and loose. We're getting shots. We're just moving through it, which I understand. Independent film, you've got to do that. But this just felt a little too jangly, like the edges were a little too rough. So overall, I didn't really come away too excited. I didn't come away entertained. This is a very kind of tough film to watch. Like it's just unforgiving, just punishing, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are films that can be that way and they still have some significance and some gravity and meaning to them. This one, I tried to at least identify with the main character as being a father and being someone who is trying to look out for his family and find justice, right? Those are all things that I could at least relate to in some way, but I don't feel like this film operated from that perspective. It felt like it was written maybe by someone who was a little more just fascinated with these people, this group, and looked for a way into that world for his story. So I think it is partially based on real events or a real case that happened, but the film, I don't know if the film maybe really doesn't do it justice. I remember watching Alpha Dog. You ever seen Alpha Dog? It's also directed by Nick Cassavetes, and it's kind of a similar thing. It's this group of young people, teenagers in, I can't remember, it was like San Diego, somewhere in California. And it's very much that vibe, but also the dark side of it, you know, the drug use, the violence, the apathy, right? That people at that age can sometimes just cling to and use to their advantage and just, you know, throw middle fingers to the world, right? Like that was kind of the vibe that I always got from that. And it's not a bad film. I actually like Alpha Dog. And I feel like this is maybe veering back into that territory, but I think it's trying way too hard. And I don't really feel like the cast is quite there with it, you know? Like as I'm watching the film, like almost every character here, I feel like, man, I could see somebody else in that role. Like who might do it, I don't know, do it better, but just do it more authentically. So the last film I want to get to here is Longlegs. And this is a recent film. It's probably still in theaters as you're hearing this or as I'm recording this. And this one is interesting because it is maybe more in line with like a horror film. Even though I don't really consider it that, I think a lot of the marketing is playing up the fact that Nicolas Cage is in this film, but they don't show him. And I think what they're inferring is that they're not showing him because he is so horrifying. With that in mind, if you go into the film understanding that, the first scene in the film does the work. The first scene is we're in this, I don't know, it's like a winter setting, and this film takes place in the 90s. So it probably works better than God is a Bullet in terms of sort of drumming up or reminding us of that era, that satanic panic era. This film is set in that period. And so the first thing we see is, it's actually a flashback. We don't know it as it's playing out, but we find out later. We see a young girl. She's outside in the snow. A car drives up. We see a man walk up to her, but we only see him from like the chest down. And it's only when he bends down to say something to her, we catch just a glimpse of his face, and then it cuts, right? We cut to, I think it's the titles or something like that. And that one like split second where we kind of half see this character's face, the character's name, his killer name, I guess, is Longlegs. That half a second that we see his face, because there's so much tension built up to like, what does he look like? Who is this? What am I about to see? I think that's the game that this film plays the entire time. It's not scary in terms of the things you do see, although it has some pretty horrifying stuff in it, right? Just stuff that kind of makes you brace, but it's more about the stuff you're not seeing yet, right? It's the buildup of like, what is right around this corner? What is right behind that door? You know, that kind of stuff. I mean, the most, I guess, like ghastly thing that we see in the film is dead center in the middle of the frame. And it's just right there in the open. And you see it. And of course, you're supposed to understand what it is. And I don't really want to say it because it might be worth you seeing the film and not having that ruined. But there's a very obvious thing in this film that is important to everything that's happening. And when we see it, it's right there in front of us. There's no looking away. There's no looking for it. It's just there. And I think that is generally the style of this film. It's like, you know, it actually kind of reminds me a little bit of, and maybe stylistically, not necessarily the story or anything super obvious, but there's just like a vibe that it has that reminds me a lot of The Shining and maybe even other Kubrick films in general. But there's this kind of like stillness, this coldness, almost like a detached kind of feeling throughout the film. I mean, whether it's like the actual camera work, whether it's the performances. I mean, Maika Monroe here, she does a great job as the main character, and she's an FBI agent who is on this case, but actually finds out there is some tie to her childhood. So it's not only like she's having to look at all this gruesome stuff that's going on, but there's also another element that is kind of eating away at the back of her mind of like, how do I know what this is? And why does this feel like it's for me in a way, right? So you've probably seen some of the, I don't know, marketing or whatever saying, ooh, like Silence of the Lambs, sort of. I mean, a little bit. There is a little bit of like Clarice vibe in this film, but there's something different happening here. Like there is a real like stilted kind of style to this film. And I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way. It's just, it doesn't feel like it's in reality, you know? People don't talk in this film like they do in real life. The other agents, the killer, nobody in here feels like this is somebody you would just run into on the street. They are very obviously movie characters. And so once you kind of understand that, you kind of settle into that in the first, 20 or 30 minutes. By the time we get to Nicolas Cage and we see him full on in this, it's like an interrogation scene. We actually see him a couple times before that, but he doesn't go anywhere. When we get to the interrogation scene, he goes everywhere. He goes to 11, 12, 13. I think he might even found 15 somewhere in there. And look, it's Nicolas Cage. What else do you expect, right? There's subtlety, but there's also this just massive just presence and this energy. He's not in the entire film. We only get him in a few spots here and there. But when it happens, you're like, okay, all right, this is not a total surprise because the film has kind of lulled me into this sort of way of telling the story. In a sense, like the comparison to The Shining, it's like, it starts sort of banal, sort of plain, moves at a certain pace. It doesn't rush anything. It lets you kind of discover things with the main character. But then the moment comes when that main character discovers some new information and truths are revealed, and then things get really big and really crazy. That's the kind of thing that I'm saying. Like this film feels sort of like that. It has that sort of ramp to it. I got to say, I mean, for holding this film down, I think Maika Monroe does a pretty good job. I think ultimately, though, the film itself, if you're down with that sort of style of telling a story like this, or that sort of pace and patience that it needs, then this will work for you. And I find myself, for the most part, being cool with that. Like, I like what we're seeing here. I like what's happening. But there were a few moments where I just felt like I would like for someone to talk normal for a second. Like there's got to be at least one character in this film that just talks like a regular person. And there really isn't that. And there are even a couple of decisions that some characters make that don't quite seem logical or realistic. And I think when that is played on top of this horror movie version of reality, it's like you start to pile on a little too much, and I start to feel like, all right, I see all the artificiality again. But for the most part, it does its job pretty good. I think it could have done without a couple of the just jump scares that weren't really anything. Because there are some moments in the film that really are actually disturbing and horrifying to consider. It lets those sit. So I don't know if that's a little bit of like a misdirect kind of thing or it's intentional, but ultimately, I like the film, you know? I think it's pretty strong. I mean, for Nicolas Cage, this is another role where he just comes in, does his thing, and bounces. And it's pretty striking. And it's hard to, just saying it like that and me going into the film, I'm like, but what does that mean? What could that possibly mean? Did they give him like a third eye or something? All right, it's not that crazy. But it is enough where to see him is one thing, but to see him in action in the scene and playing this character, it's something else. It's pretty strong in that regard. It lets you know what its intention is and the style that it's going to tell you the story in. and it doesn't betray that, you know? And I guess that's the positive side to it is, yeah, it might be frustrating in a moment or two, but it sticks to its guns. I give it that. So, and actually it even made me consider like, all right, what else has this filmmaker done? Because I'm just not familiar with Osgood Perkins as a filmmaker. I definitely want to go see what other films he's done, because this sort of style, it's kind of alluring in a way, you know? And in my mind, at least, the idea that maybe it's sort of adjacent to something Kubrick would do, I'm interested in that, of course. So anyway, you know, there's a few films that I just saw recently, and yeah, are they all based around Maika Monroe? Yes. Do I think she's doing some interesting work? Yes. I feel like she's gotten some looks at things that maybe didn't really work out, you know, whether it's like the Independence Day sequel or, you know, some of these other films that I think are probably meant to be a little more mainstream that for whatever reason it didn't hit. But I think the things that are strong that she's doing, I think they'll stand the test of time. I mean, I still think The Guest is great. It Follows. I mean, they're making a sequel to it after all these years. So, I mean, it's got to be worth something, right? I'll get to it one day, I promise. So anyway, that's it for me this episode. If you want to find some others, you can go to filmstreak.com. You can subscribe. This podcast is on YouTube now, which, you know, it's an audio only podcast, but it's there if that's easier for you. You can always go to the website and sign up to get new episodes by email. Thank you to all the people who have gone there, signed up. I don't do spam and all that. It's just to like let you know when a new episode is out, and that way you get it right there to your inbox. Hopefully that's easier if you don't do the podcast apps and, you know, all that stuff. Hey, happy to do it. Otherwise, yeah, there's the list of all these films on IMDb. That's where I keep track of all these, and you can go there, add them to your list, or you can find out where to watch them, where to stream them. So anyway, that's it for me for now. It's hot. Summer is almost over. I really would like to have some cooler weather, I think. But until then, I'm going to go find me a dark theater. I've got a pretty big new movie coming up that I really want to talk about. So I'm going to go check that out. Hey, how about you? You go watch something new.